Thank you, Nagma, and welcome again, dear friends, to Edge 2020. I'm really excited to be having this conversation this evening with Ashish Dhawan. But before we proceed, I wanted to begin this conversation by highlighting the fascinating interplay of issues in education. India has possibly the largest school system in the world, with over 1.5 million schools, 260 million children, with a majority of them in the government school system, 10 million teachers, and approximately zero point 0.2 million government functionaries. Maharashtra, with over 600,000 teachers alone, employs more people than at TCS, one of India's largest companies. But this is without the same organization system's backbone that an equivalent private sector organization has in terms of people, processes, infrastructure, and budgets. So the scale of the issue is large. Then we have the correlation between education and employment. Education must match the skills that employers need by proving learning outcomes and providing vocational training. Finally, the role of access to financing and technology to leverage educational and learning aids is also very important and needs highlighting. Additionally, we have noticed and heard from our partners that student dropout continues to be one of the biggest challenges that we face at all levels. And after years of discussing infrastructure requirements of schools, we have now realized that these discussions are subordinate to the ones we need to be having on learning outcomes. We have seen some extraordinary examples of Shanti Niketan and Nahi Taaleem, which are schools started in the open to provide experiential learning to make children future ready. These are the kinds of initiatives which may have to take precedence over the kinds of programs we were earlier focusing on. Further, assessments need a transformation from summative or recall-based to formative or conceptual understanding. And the definition of a child's learning and ability has changed as we have had to adapt, even transform the methods with which we are teaching them. We're also seeing a great, really heartening increase in the engagement of parents in their child's learning, whether by force or choice. This has been an exceptional inclusion into the educational journey for children and something we've all hoped for, because there's a huge positive correlation between parental involvement and learning outcomes for children. Lastly, there's an increased spotlight on government ownership and accountability of the education outcomes, new debates on policy and increased competition among states, with education even becoming an election issue is what we've been seeing. So to help me make sense of these tangled issues and to chart the role of philanthropy in finding solutions, I'm super honored to have Ashish join us this evening. As founder chairman of Central Square Foundation and Ashoka University, he has made a significant impact in education. He himself, of course, has impeccable educational and career credentials with an undergraduate degree from Yale and an MBA from Harvard, and an initial innings at Goldman, and then building a fine and highly successful private equity firm in Chris Cap. I know Ashish as a fine thinker, a strategist with a cool and calm demeanor. He represents the new modern face of Indian philanthropy. Thoughtful, data-oriented, impatient, but willing to play the long game, a role model, yet willing to learn, experiment, and share. He has said that he had planned to be an entrepreneur by the time he was 30, and that he would do something in education by the age of 45. I think he achieved both with a few years to go. Ashish, let me welcome and very happy to have you here. And I'd love to open this conversation that will cover both your personal journey and the issues on education. by asking you, I'm sure you're usually introduced as someone who left a highly successful career on Wall Street to come back to India and private equity to start Central Square and Ashoka. There is a presumption of sacrifice. How do you react to this?
Actually, no, I don't think there's much sacrifice, Vidya, because I actually really admire the young people who, when they come out of college or out of graduate school, decide that they're going to go into the social sector or into some sphere where they're making a huge sacrifice in terms of compensation or a hardship posting in terms of geographic location. I mean, that is real sacrifice. I mean, for me, I was very privileged. I had education where I was earning a lot of money coming straight out. I then started my own firm and got very lucky and made financially was very secure and very well off. And so it was hardly a sacrifice. It was a very easy decision in some ways, at least financially. It's more emotionally, intellectually that I wouldn't call it a sacrifice, but it's a hard decision. There's sort of inertia. You know, you like what you do. I love being an investor. You're used to that sort of, and breaking away from that is hard. Or, emotionally, sometimes you get attached to the people you work with, the things you're doing, the ecosystem you're surrounded with, and to break away from that. And then, of course, there's the fear that if you're going to leave what you're already good at, could you not, maybe you'll be completely unsuccessful at something new. So, it's more those things at a very personal level that I play, as opposed to, I wouldn't use the word sacrifice, but more experimentation, going into the unknown, breaking away from, something that you're used to doing and getting out of that inertia. That's what those are the words I would use.
Yeah. I said this before, and I've heard you say before that you plan to be an entrepreneur in your 30s. You wanted to do something in education in your 40s. So you're clearly not an accidental philanthropist. So what made you, move specifically towards philanthropy or education? Why not say something like policy or politics?
Yeah. No, I honestly, when I was 30 years old, I did think about that. I mean, I think that being in politics or being in government is the highest service in a sense, and you can have the greatest impact. I soon realized that, you have to realize what your forte is. And I feel that given my own skill sets in terms of whether it's strategic thinking or entrepreneurial ability, having my own mind, I'm an independent thinker. I don't like to kowtow or toe the line. I can't do a lot of backslapping. It's not my thing. So maybe getting into politics was not for me, but instead being on the outside may be more, I know in a way it's chickening out, but you can't have the same influence, but in a way you can have different influence. I think you can be a little bit more iconoclastic. You can think differently. You can make new, bold suggestions when you're on the outside, as opposed to being a player on the inside. Whereas if you're on the inside, you have the levers under your control. I think on the outside, you have to deal with the fact that you may work very hard on something and it feels like you've just pushed water uphill and somebody leaves and the water comes rushing back. So there's more frustration, there's less under your control, but at the same time, you don't have to kowtow. You can think differently. You have the time to actually look globally or elsewhere to see what's worked, what hasn't, to be more strategic, to experiment more. So those are the things that I cherish, and I think they play to my strengths in a sense.
Yeah, I think I met you in 2010 or thereabouts when you were just making the transition. And I was struck not only by your understanding of the education space, but also your clarity of vision. I remember you talking about visiting Finland and the United States to understand about some of the great models. So could you tell us about your early days in philanthropy, your journey as it were?
Yeah. So I started, when I was Vidya, when I was in my full-time job, it was obviously cutting checks, small amounts, more as a way to learn, to get to meet the people, to go and see some of the work on the field. it just got me interested, to be honest, even to read a few books, to read annual reports of the NGOs, other foundations. It's my learning journey is the way I describe it. In that first decade when I was busy working, but I could maybe allocate 2 to 5% of my time and a small fraction of my wealth towards being a small grant making philanthropist. When I said this is going to be a career, then I wanted to be more deliberate about it. For me, it's like I'm a problem solver. I want to really understand the problem deeply, whether it's any business you're in, it's a similar thing. You would get to know it cold, right? And so I probably read, I think in that 3-4 year phase, 80 to 100 books on education, on system change, how does government work, etc. I made a trip to the US where I took a month off and I visited, I think, 70 or 80 different education nonprofits across people working on curriculum, assessment, leadership training, principal development, teacher training, ed tech, variety of different areas. I made a trip to China because I wanted to understand their school system. I visited Singapore to visit NIE, which I think is the best teacher training and principal training institution in the world, possibly. So it was just, for me, it was a way to sort of learn and then think, and within India as well, to meet, of course, all the NGOs, to sort of map it out, to meet with some state governments, to read all our policy documents. And so just to be really well informed about the state of where things are, what's been tried in the past, what's worked elsewhere, and to develop a little bit of my own thinking as to how one can look at system reform in India, what our highest priorities need to be, and how you could do things differently than have been done in the past. How do you leverage different players? Because the ecosystem has lots of different players. What are their strengths? And how can one get them to maybe play a slightly different role so that it can lead more to system reform as opposed to just programmatic work? So I think this period of, and I wouldn't say it's only in that transition period, but also you learn every day. I mean, even in the first 5 years when I first started, made tons of mistakes. But like an investor, my belief was always start by writing smaller checks. And so you make your mistakes, early on, you have a smaller team, you're more hands-on. And then you sort of, I would say the first 5 years, it was a lot of learning by doing. And then thereafter, we had a much more of a clearer strategic plan with a narrower focus going forward.
I think one of the things you've also spoken about, you've believed very strongly in, and you've advocated is, what you call foundational learning. So
Yeah.
could you speak to us a bit about that? And, what are the new developments in this space that really excite you?
Yeah. So I think, as you said, Vidya, I'm a data-driven person, and I look at our education system. And when you see ASAR data over the last 15 years, it's very clear that learning is breaking down early. I mean, ASAR shows you that 70% of children, 75% of children fall behind by class 3. They can't read second grade texts. They can't do basic arithmetic operations. And by class 5, they're sort of, you've lost most of these kids because, class 3 is that critical juncture where you switch from learning to read to reading to learn. And so if you can't read by class 5 or class 6, you can't transact the curriculum. If you can't do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, you can't do fractions, you can't do algebra, right? So these are basic building blocks. And so I think if you have a leaky pipe, you'll go upstream to fix it. I mean, it's common sense, right? Or if you look at like all the other systems around the world, we talk about how Vietnam has a fantastic education system. It's a country with India's per capita income, but in PISA, it does as well as the US. And why is it so? It's because Vietnam invested in foundational learning like 20 years ago, 25 years. Why is China so far ahead? They invested in foundational learning 20, 25 years ago. Why did South Korea become South Korea? Because in the late 60s and 70s, they prioritized foundational learning. So why is Peru the most improved country on PISA over the last decade? The president launched a mission on foundational literacy and numeracy. So it's common sense that this is what we should be doing. If learning is breaking down early, this should be the number one priority. And so I've been shouting from the rooftops around this. I think the data, the evidence is very clear on this. And I'm so glad that the new education policy really calls this out in a very significant way. I mean, if you look at everything in the new education, there are lots of good ideas, but for foundational learning, it says it's the number one priority in school education. It needs to be put into mission mode, and by 2025, we need to solve this problem. It's the only thing that's really time bound, because otherwise the NEP is more of a guiding policy document, but it's very, very clear in terms of what needs to be done. And then subsequently, the government has picked up the threads, and the Prime Minister on September 11th actually announced a new mission called the Nipun Bharat Mission, which is focused on foundational learning to all teachers in the country. He was on a video call with all the teachers celebrating Teachers' Day. It was a series of events, and he launched this mission. So I think India finally is taking this very, very seriously, and I'm very, very excited about that as a result. And I believe that all of us can come together really to work in conjunction with the government at the state level, with NGOs, funders, all the actors, the curricular experts, to say, can we really, by 2025, in 5 years, take learning poverty? So the World Bank launched this report on learning poverty. Basically, India is at 55%, which is children in class 5. 55% can't read third grade text. Sri Lanka is at 15%. So I think the challenge for us is in the next decade, can we get this down to 15%? And in the next 5 years, can we get it down to maybe 35%? I mean, that to me feels like a very realistic goal. And can we all come together to make this happen?
I think the other thing that you've done really beautifully, Ashish, is really look at education through a systems lens. And a lot of the work you've done at Central Square Foundation is to work with the central government, state governments, with Niti Aayog. How has that experience been? And, especially because a lot of philanthropists stay away from, looking at systems change. So what would be, your sort of experience and your advice to us?
Yeah. So look, firstly, I'm an investor at heart, and I look at ROI and ROE. ROI is what's the return on investment, which is if the government's spending 6 lakh crore on education and we are spending piddly sums in comparison. I think the biggest one is we can drive innovation, which government can never. But if we can make that 6 lakh crore more effective, right, which is improve the system, that's the highest ROI investment. It's super risky, it's super hard, but it's by far the highest ROI investment. So I pick system change any day, because anything else feels like it's not scalable, and neither is it sustainable. I mean, if you look at every NGO program in the world, at some point it fizzles out, right? Because there's donor fatigue, to staying the course, or the system, there's a good secretary, and then eventually there's somebody else, and there's so much volatility in the system. So I think system change is the only way to fundamentally sort of improve, and it's the highest ROI. And frankly, it's also the highest ROE, which is return on effort. At the end of the day, we can spend our time doing lots of things, but if we go after this big audacious goal, I think it's eventually, I have one lifetime. I want to make a difference not in 50 years, because I won't be around in 50 years, but in the next 10 years, I want to see India's foundational learning improve. And, if that's the case, I think this picking foundational learning, working with state governments in the system and with all the other actors is the highest return on effort as well.
Yeah. I was also, especially in the context of government, while cynicism is the enemy of optimism, as somebody said, especially around policy, how do you keep the faith, and what change have you seen since you began?
Yeah, no, so I think you're right, Vidya. It's a frustrating experience. Look, I always say the highs are higher and the lows are lower, because you can work for 2 years or 3 years and somebody changes and all the work goes to naught, and people don't appreciate it sometimes, or you can push for some policy change and nothing happens. It can even become policy, but nothing happens with it, right? So there's obviously, it's not, I don't mean to paint a false picture here. It's got severe ups and downs. My big realization at some point was we have to take it to the political level. We cannot stay at just the bureaucratic level. Obviously, the bureaucrats get the work done and they're critical, but we have to take it to the political level. And so I've personally presented to the Prime Minister on 3 occasions. I've gone to, as you said, Niti Aayog, to the people in the party, to various people who are in parliament to talk about this issue, to chief ministers' offices. So I believe that we need to get this to be politically salient. And I think Delhi proved to us, the AAP government in Delhi, that this can become a political issue. I mean, when they ran for the elections the second time around, education was front and center. And I think we have to show to chief ministers that you really can make a difference in a 5-year window, and that foundational learning is the most visible. If a child can read, nothing is more visible than that to a parent, right? If a child can speak confidently, nothing is more visible than that to a parent. And so you can get the parents also bought into this. So I feel like the biggest achievement we've had is the fact that this is becoming a national mission. Because now once it's a national mission, the demand side is unlocked. Because often the challenge with policy change or any program we run is it is pushing water uphill. That at some point, the doors open again or the floodgates open and it comes, there's it running back and you've achieved nothing. But if you unlock the demand side, which is it becomes a national mission, states have to compete with each other. It's no longer you're begging the bureaucrats to do something, but almost I went into a meeting, we are working in Uttar Pradesh with the chief minister, where the chief minister sort of was saying, I want to make my state, I'm ranked XYZ on SECI, I want to get my state into the top 5 in the next 10 years, And this national mission is coming. I want UP to really improve this national mission. And now we've heard it from many chief ministers saying, this national mission is coming. We really want to do well on this national. So to me, that's the demand side. If we can unlock the demand side, that's the way we really see change and eventually show politicians that they can win over parents, this can be visible and change can happen within a 5-year period of time. I still think we're not completely there, but we're getting there.
Right. So, I return to Ashoka now, because I think it was one of the largest fundraisers and very successful for for a university, for a private university. You actually raised money effectively for a non-profit venture. You've done very successful fundraising in the past, even as a private equity firm. So what lessons have you learned that you can share with non-profits on this call about fundraising?
Yeah, so I think a few things. One is I would say, you need a bold mission and vision. Ashoka has a bold one, which is to be the leading liberal arts and sciences university in India, to eventually get to Ivy League quality, to transform Indian higher education. The way IITs made engineering prestigious, can Ashoka make liberal arts education or multidisciplinary education? So it's not just build one institution to actually have a knock-on effect on higher ed. So I think you need that big vision, bold vision, etc., which excites donors, right? 2 is, I think you have to show early wins. You've got to get a few things. Even at Ashoka, we didn't go early on and make a big ask. It was early on, we started with the YF program. It was, come and fund a scholarship. People did that. The program did really well. By the 3rd year, there were 3,000 applications for 100 spots. We had our first Rhodes Scholar come out. People could see, oh my God. And we all, our ask was 8 lakhs the first year for a fellowship, for a scholarship. By the 2nd year, we did like a 2-for-1 deal. We said for 10 lakhs, you'll get 2 scholarships because we had lowered the cost. So it was these baby steps and showing results, was very critical. And then at some point we built the infrastructure. I don't think you can fundraise. Obviously the leaders have to play an important role, but you also need a team and you have to invest in getting the right team on board to make it happen because it's not a side activity. For an NGO, it's your revenue. right? And so if it's going to be your revenue, you have to pay a lot of attention to it. You have to do lots of meetings. You have to deal with the frustration of any process. You'll have a 95% rejection rate, but that's okay. You got to wake up every morning saying, I'm going to do it again, right? And not give up. So that persistence, that methodical approach to doing it, the investment in the people is very, very critical. And I think the leader, for smaller NGOs, it's the leader who needs to. I mean, I always say, if you look at US universities, which have raised the most money of any NGOs, if you talk to a typical US university president, they spend 60% of their time fundraising. So the message I would have to leaders of nonprofits is, you shouldn't feel ashamed if you have to spend 30, 40, 50% of your time fundraising. I mean, you may not like it, but start to like it and start to make it like your number one priority alongside delivering against your programs. That's the only way you can sort of scale your organization, if that's your objective.
So Ashish, if you go back to private equity, just imagine, what were the learnings you would take back from all the work that you've done in education over the last, 10, 15 years now?
Yeah, so I go back to being an investor. In private equity, I avoided government like the plague. I probably would still do that because I don't think there's any upside. But I think the big lesson for me would be, when I was an investor, I was only focused on IRR and making returns for my investors and, building a good track record and things like that. I never really thought hard about how we could really change our companies to help them have a greater impact on society. And what are some of those levers, Could we insist with our companies that they have more women in the workforce and more women in leadership positions on the boards? Could we push them to be more environmentally conscious? Those are things, to be honest, we didn't do at all. We were just focused on growth, EBITDA margin, return on equity. And I think if I were to go back and do it today, I definitely believe that shareholders are important stakeholders, but I do believe in stakeholder capitalism more and more. And I think as primary shareholders, it's your responsibility to create. I always believed, Nitin Noria was my professor at business school, and he always said, business is a force for good. And to be honest, I've now realized this after actually having been in the NGO space, that business actually can be a force for good if you do it right. And that's something I would do differently if I were to go back.
Ashish, you may have come across the EdelGive Philanthropy list, where we've been recently seeing, not only the older philanthropists, but also sort of a new breed of philanthropists, new young people who are really getting more and more interested in philanthropy. And we expect that with the amount of new wealth that's being created in the country, we should hopefully have a list of 500 people at least. A lot of them are really struggling or grappling with how do you start? Where do you start? And given your experience and your journey, could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm very excited about this trend because I think first generation entrepreneurs are really going to be the most, obviously they won't necessarily be the very biggest. The industrialists will be the very biggest philanthropists, people like Mr. Premji. But I think that the most cutting edge work could be done by this next generation of philanthropists, younger, some in their 30s, 40s, 50s. Many of them have made their money in tech or new age businesses. They're very thoughtful, they're very committed, and they want to do things differently. And I've had the chance to interact with several of them. And I think they're starting now. So I think one way to start is, look, I think it's always a lame excuse to say, I don't know what to do. Just do something, even if you're going to make a mistake. You don't have to be so scientific. There are lots of good NGOs in India. Just ask around. And initially, if you don't have the time, just give to somebody. If you're interested in work around law and justice, give money to whether it's Vidhi or Daksh or Agami or whoever you find there, if you do your homework, like any other person, with a few phone calls, you can find who are some interesting orgs doing work in an area that interests you. So figure out one or two areas that interest you and find one or two organizations in those areas and just, start giving some money, but in the process also start learning from those orgs and start reading up, and I think that's the easiest way to get started. A second one is to participate in these collective, things that are coming up now. So I've been part of this ACT group, which Mohit Bhatnagar and Prashant Prakash and others have helped get started. The whole venture entrepreneurial ecosystem, a lot of energy. They did some work around COVID. And now I've been working with Mohit and Makin. We're starting an ACT education fund, and Prashant and GV are doing something around environment. So again, it's a collective. I mean, we launched this education thing and like 2 months ago, and there are already like 15, 20 people. And many of them, I'm sure, are writing their first check. So it's a first check alongside others who they know, maybe they respect, and it's also a learning journey for them. We'll do monthly meetings with these people to keep them apprised and keep them. So I think that's another great way to get started. It's part of a collective. I mean, Ashoka, we have now about 150 founders. I can tell you for many people, it was either the first or the largest check ever. And, they were just excited about building a new institution. And I think through the Ashoka journey, they've started to do more, as a result of that. So I think just starting somewhere, either out of your own passion, or you come across a great project, or you participate in a collective. I mean, that's a great way to get going, is my sense.
So let's just come to, I was just thinking, in the midst of this crisis, how have you and, both Ashoka as well as Central Square, how have you reacted? And especially, has it been a time where you've been, because you're a very clear thinker, have you been riddled with self-doubt? Have your beliefs been tested? So if you could talk to us about that.
Yeah. So I would say, I have not done much, quite candidly, in terms of COVID relief work. I was just so caught up with our own things at Ashoka or CSF, or I started like 5 other things in the last 3 years. So just protecting those and also seeing if these orgs could do things differently was my main focus. I mean, I only gave a little bit of money to the ACT COVID fund as COVID. So in that sense, I'm guilty of not saying I'm going to chuck up everything else and just focus on whether it's migrant labor or health or what have you. Obviously, within school education, we did a lot in terms of COVID response, right? Working with state governments, or at Ashoka, building a lot of digital muscle, remote teaching, obviously health and safety on campus, those kinds of things. I think there were moments of self-doubt. I think a few things. I mean, one is, I think it just shows you how frail nonprofits are. And so for me, I think it's just makes me realize that, with any of the work we do, how do we really get, I feel very bad for people who, run NGOs where we know how this year is so bad with CSR going towards COVID, PM care, or even just the profit pool shrinking. That how do we really help people sort of bulletproof their balance sheet a little bit to tide over these times? And it made me just realize that, look, maybe these things won't survive as long as we think they will. And so COVID, I think, woke me up to that. It's my own doubts around, am I doing the right things? Am I prioritized on the right areas? And some self-doubt around that. As well. I mean, it's funny, I do most of my work in development, and yet my own belief is that India will grow because of the front end, the engine being economic development, not social development. And I know philanthropy's role is not necessarily to drive economic development, but can you do more as a philanthropist around some catalytic things can make that happen? Is something I keep thinking about, because I'm not doing anything there. So some self-doubt around, strategically yeah, education is a no-brainer, right? In that sense. But should you be allocating money a little bit differently? Maybe more to even greater injustice, because you also see, I think, through the crisis that, just there's so much injustice and it's perpetuated, and it's at the root cause of a lot of problems, whether it's health or education, comes from that power structure. And I've never really thought about, should I be funding Dalit causes, or should I be funding things that are deeper in the interior of India? So I think those kinds of things have sort of popped up in my head in terms of, am I doing the right thing? Am I working with organizations that really can sustain for the longer term? Things like that. Even though I wasn't doing direct COVID related work, it sort of made me introspect a little bit. And then how do you do things differently post COVID, which I think a lot of people are thinking about in terms of leveraging technology or, things like that as well.
Thank you so much, Ashish, for joining us today. It's just been fascinating listening to you, and we're sort of running out of time, so I'll have to close this here. Thank you again. Thank you.
It's my honor. Thank you for inviting me, Vidya.